Hello friends, and welcome again to this edition of A Walk in the Garden Bible Study. This is part 2 in our study of Genesis chapter 25. And if you're with us for our last lesson, you remember we already read the first few verses of chapter 25, and we started to delve into it a little bit. But for the sake of time, we're not going to reread those verses, but we are looking at verses 1 through 10. And as we had begun to look at those verses in our last lesson, one thing that we were looking at is that now, even after the death of Sarah, even after the marriage of Isaac and Rebekah, we see that even Abraham, once again, took him a wife. And the Bible tells us that her name was Keturah. And not only that, but he fathered 6 children by her. And not only that, but if that wasn't enough to keep him busy, the Bible tells us he also took upon himself his household concubines. And so this was to be a unique and interesting feature that suddenly appeared on the scene. You know, we first saw this back in chapter 22 when the Bible mentions that Abraham's brother Nahor, he was mentioned as having a concubine. And so now, in a sense, maybe, was this something that Abraham had, maybe gotten the idea from his brother perhaps? Or maybe he just thought that it might be a good idea to have these extra family members. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit, what his reasoning might have been for not only taking on himself another wife, but also having these concubines. And this was going to be a little bit different than, when he had the second wife there to Sarah, and we saw Hagar there that had become his actual secondary wife as opposed to being a concubine. So we're going to talk about that a little bit today. And a concubine, in a sense, was tied to the man almost as a husband-wife relationship, but to a lesser degree. The concubine was in a standing in the household inferior to that of the wife of the man. So whereas a secondary wife might have equal stature or equal standing, maybe he's got one that he prefers a little bit more than the other one, but basically as far as duties, responsibilities, and just their level of authority in the household, a secondary wife would be almost on the same plane, the same level. Sometimes just barely marginal difference between the two. But in a concubine sense, there was a much larger gap, that even though they had a relationship with him, even though they may have children with him, they were still basically just a household servant, a maidservant, if you will, that was in response, they had their assigned responsibilities, had their assigned household duties, and this was just almost another duty that they had, was to the master of the household. And so that's kind of how that tied in there. Now they would get some extra privileges by the relationships that they would have. They would get some extra possessions perhaps, and maybe have some be looked after a little bit higher degree than just a standard servant would. But other than that, they still had basically the same position as a servant in the household. And it was a recognized relationship, but not in the sense of a legal God-ordained marriage. And so what was it that resulted in the creation of this position? Because, it didn't start out that way. I mean, when God created man and woman, he made one woman for one man. And, we read about Adam and Eve and how he took the rib out of Adam. And Adam said, "This is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh." And therefore the two, when they come together, the woman is the completer of the man. And so you can't have, when you've got something that's been completed, it's become whole, and you just can't add anything to it. I mean, there's no way, unless you're going to have some kind of deformity in the creation, because once it's whole, it's whole. It's 100%. And so it wasn't intended to have these, extramarital relationships. But there could have been several factors for this. Many households needed extra servants and extra help in handling the daily activities. And it would be easier to keep allegiance, it would be easier to keep faithful service if they basically grafted them in or had them added in to the immediate family. And so, they could normally be there working around the household. They could be there showing up for their service every day, but it was just a much more convenient thing and much more effective if they could stay there on a permanent basis and basically just live in the household and become, in actuality, part of the immediate family. Another possibility was to do with children. Every Jewish man wanted as large of a family as possible so they could propagate, so they could have more descendants, they could have more lineage, they could have more outreach. And also the fact that a lot of them did think about the continuance on, and perhaps in their lineage would eventually become royalty, or even the fact it could be the Messiah, could be in their line possibly. So those were all things that went through their minds. But the Bible talks about how they looked upon it as a great blessing to have a large family. The more children they had, the more blessed they were. And it talks about them being, he kind of describes them as being arrows in the quiver, and it says, "Blessed is the man that has his quiver full." And so there's some religious groups even today, or maybe in the not so far past, that kind of use this concept as well. And you probably the groups I'm talking about, but there's certain religious groups that put great weight and great significance on having large families. They don't care if it's a burden on the family. They don't care if you're financially able. They don't care if you're going to have to struggle or whatever the case is. And then there's some groups that even, maybe not so much anymore, but at one time they even encouraged the man to have multiple wives. And of course they got carried away, and there was a lot of despondency there. There was a lot of unhappy marriages and a lot of unhappy alliances because of that. But that's what they did. They take things out of context. They take things that they want to implement into their religion, so to speak, and then they try to use Scripture to back it up and then put the heat on or put the guilt trip on the family member to where they feel like they're obligated to do that very thing. But every Jewish man wanted as large a family as possible so they could have as many descendants as possible. And one wife was only capable of so many children, but if they had the additions of either secondary wives or of concubines, then that would increase their family size and their rankings and their outlay of descendants. And so the wife was more or less a wife, and then you had a secondary wife that could be, more or less be in, like we said, almost the same status. And then of course you had the status of the concubines. But there's many societies that still operate today worldwide that still operate on these basic principles of multiple marriages and multiple wives and having the large family outreach. And so it even got to the point where it even got to the point in the Bible where laws were developed to handle various situations that would arise, including laws that provided for their protection and even the protection of the concubines, and setting limits to the relation they sustained to the household to which they belonged. And many of these are recorded in the Scriptures themselves. They had no authority in the family, nor could they share in the household government. And so that's what we were talking about with those differences. Because, and so for sure, these type of situations, a lot of times they would cause a great deal of grief. They would cause a great deal of animosity within the house walls. And in many instances, the concubines would be eventually dismissed and cast off in order to preserve the peace in the household. And they could do that. So that's one thing about having that status, is basically they could just be let go. They could be dismissed, almost like they were being fired from their position. And you can only imagine what feelings would the woman in that position would have. I mean, here she is, she's got this close relation, she's bore children to the man of the household. She's hopefully that they would gain them some recognition and possibly some advantages in raising her children, and maybe give them some advantages. But in all likelihood, it could result in her just being dismissed and basically saying, "Go on your way. I'm done with you. I've had enough. our relation's over and you can leave. You're fired. So for sure there was a lot of anguish probably in certain families because of that. And it could never be an effective arrangement because it went against the God-instituted one flesh principle that God initiated in the Garden of Eden. And so, Christianity as a whole has effectively restored the sacred institution of marriage to its original character. And any other addition would fall under the heading of fornication or adultery or bigamy. So Christianity has formalized it, has restored it to the true nature of marriage, the way it was intended. And if there's any other kind of relationship that comes into play, then it falls under one of these other categories that we see mentioned in the Bible as well. Whether it be under the heading of fornication, whether it be under the heading of adultery, or what we would call as bigamy, or even polygamy for that matter. But we see here in these first 10 verses a recorded history of some of Abraham's genealogy. And what does it tell us? It tells us that this new wife that he has in his old age, Keturah, bare him Amram and Jokshan and Medan and Midian and Ishbak and Shua. And then it goes on to tell us that Jokshan begat Sheba and Dedan bore Ashurim and Letsushim and Lebumim, and Midian begat Ephah and Epher and Hanok and Abada and Eldah. These all spanned out from Abraham's wife, Keturah. And it's pretty remarkable, we were talking about the fact that when Abraham bore Isaac, he was 100 years old. I mean, he was considered an old man, well stricken in years, just about beyond, child rearing age. And then raised Isaac. Isaac gets married at 40 years of age. And so here's Abraham now, probably, around 140 years old. And he goes on to take upon himself another wife, but not only that, but is able to bear more children. And so we were talking about that, how the fact that seemingly it's God's promise, that when God promised him that he would prosper and that he would have seed and that would be multiplied as the sands of the seashore, as the stars in the sky, well, it was going to happen. Yes, it was going to happen through Isaac, but obviously, it was going to happen in other, through Ishmael. It was going to happen through Keturah. It was going to happen through, these other children that are mentioned that are going to carry out his descendants. So he's going to have a great influence and a great impact on that region. And so he would have had plenty of descendants from just Isaac alone if he'd have stayed the course. But as a result, he's going to even have more outreach. And so all these descendants here spanned out from Keturah. And as we see with the poor concubines, what does it tell us? It says Abraham had children with them as well, but it's interesting to see that none of them, not a single one, are mentioned by name. Simply that everything he had, everything he owned, everything that he would bequeath would go to Isaac, and the rest of the family would merely receive gifts, and, as we said, they would be sent away. So he would look out for them, he would provide for them, he would give them some sustenance, but they would be dismissed and to go on their way because they were not to have any inheritance or any influence or impact upon the chosen one, and that was Isaac and his family. And so it is here now that we see the death of Abraham, a great man, a mighty man, a blessed man of the Lord, a man called out by the Lord, a man who lived an abundant life. And how old was he? Well, he was 175 years old when he died. A ripe old age, even then. And it tells us that he gave up the ghost and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. So, he lived 100 years in the land of Canaan, which is kind of hard to believe. But he was always considered a stranger in a strange land, just a pilgrim passing through. And but here's where he'd planted himself down. He settled his roots there. He raised his family, and we saw many different significant events that took place there. And this was a land where he was just considered a sojourner. And so we don't see a huge ceremony concerning Abraham's burial. We don't see a lot of pomp and circumstance. We don't see any great gatherings or any great formalities really at all. What does it tell us? It says his sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah in the field of Ephron, the sons of Zohar the Hittite, the son of Zohar the Hittite, which is before Mamre, in the field that he purchased of the sons of Heth. And so it was that he was buried alongside Sarah his wife. The last office of respect was now to be paid by his two sons. In spite of their previous differences, in spite of their, the challenges that they had to get along, in spite of the separation that they had chose to make things peaceful, they would now set those aside and come together to pay last respects to their good father. And we see that a lot today. I mean, people spread out, they lose track of each other, families, they get, to where they maybe don't communicate too much and they really don't have any close relations. But if there's one thing, even more than a wedding, that will bring the family back together, it's a sad thing to say, but that's true. It's a death. It's a death in the family will tend to bring people back together because they want to pay those last respects, and rightfully so. And so they'll gather together for that, and it gives them a chance to maybe rekindle some relationships, to see people they haven't seen in a while. But most of all, they're there to give their support for their family member, and just to show the respect by being there at the funeral and possibly at the burial. And so in spite of their previous differences, they now would set those aside and come together to pay their last respects. There'd been some obvious distance between them, both spiritually and physically. And so it was either that Abraham had brought them together prior to his death, or it was the death itself that had reunited them for this very event. Either way, the task would be carried out, and Abraham was now gone, and he was laid to rest by his sons and by his wife Sarah in the same burial sepulcher. With that, we're going to pick it up in verses 11 through 18. And it came to pass after the death of Abraham that God blessed his son Isaac. And Isaac dwelt by the well Lahairoi. Now these are the generations of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's handmaid, bare unto Abraham. And these are the names of the sons of Ishmael by their names, according to their generations. The firstborn of Ishmael, Nebajoth, and Kedar, and Adbeel, and Mibsam, and Mishma, and Dumah, and Massa, Hadar, and Tema, Jeter, Naphish, and Kedemah. These are the sons of Ishmael, and these are their names by their towns and by their castles, 12 princes according to their nations. And these are the years of the life of Ishmael, 137 years, and he gave up the ghost and died, and was gathered unto his people. And they dwelt from Havilah unto Shur, that is before Egypt, as thou goest toward Assyria, and he died in the presence of all his brethren. And so it is that we see here that immediately after the account of the death of Abraham, the narrative now shifts to his son Isaac. And notice that the blessings of God did not die with Abraham, but were rather carried on to his sons. What does it say? It says that God blessed his son Isaac. And what we will see here is that the blessing is passed on to all of Abraham's children. Because what does it say? Well, it's going to relate to us, first of all, the genealogy of his brother Ishmael. Ishmael, the son of Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's handmaid. And what would he do? Well, he would bear 12 sons, who are also described as princes. So they were known by their names, by their towns, by their mansions or castles, and even by their nations. So how prosperous they were. All distinctive tribes, all very numerous, all very considerable. It would be they that would be the people that would people the land that lay between Egypt and Assyria, the land known as Arabia. And so it was as well that there were to be considerable wealth and riches involved, because he was one of Abraham's children. And so thusly we have a short account of Ishmael's life and times, and after it gives his genealogy, it simply names the 12 sons' names and the 12 tribes, and talks about how they were even raised to elevated to the positions of being called princes. And that's about it. It's just summed up in these few verses. And then what do we see? It says Ishmael gave up the ghost and died, and he was 137 years old. He died in the presence of all his brethren. And though we read that he was gathered unto his people, what we don't read is that he was full of days. Even though he lived to be of a considerable age as well. You know, back in chapter 16, God had told Hagar that Ishmael would dwell in the presence of all of his brethren. And here we see that not only did he live in their presence, but he would die in their presence as well. He was surrounded by those that he loved until the very end, when he could hold no more. And so it was that Ishmael was no more. He gave up the ghost, he died, and was gathered unto his people. And it's interesting to note here too, as we see these ages, it's kind of a continual digression of the longevity. And as time goes on, as generations pass, and as the decades go by them, we see the shorter and the shorter period of the longevity of man. The lifespans are becoming shorter and shorter. And with that, I think we still got a few minutes. We're going to go ahead and look at these next verses, verses 19 through 28. And so this is another account here, and what does the Bible tell us? It says, well, now we've seen the generations of of Ishmael. Now it's going to give us the generations of Isaac. And the Bible says here, and these are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham begat Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah to wife, the daughter of Bethuel the Syrian of Pandanaram, the sister to Laban the Syrian. And Isaac entreated the Lord for his wife, because she was barren. And the Lord was entreated of him, and Rebekah his wife conceived. And the children struggled together within her, and she said, if it be so, why am I thus? And she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said unto her, 2 nations are in thy womb, and 2 manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels. And the one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger. And when her days to be delivered were fulfilled, behold, there were twins in her womb. And the first came out red all over like a hairy garment, and they called his name Esau. And after that came his brother out, and his hand took hold on Esau's heel, and his name was called Jacob. And Isaac was 80 years old when she bare them. And the boys grew, and Esau was a cunning hunter, a man of the field, and Jacob was a plain man, dwelling in tents. And Isaac loved Esau because he did eat of his venison, but Rebekah loved Jacob. So this is going to be a pretty full account here. We're going to see some really interesting things with these children. But the first thing we see here is we're made aware of the descendants of Isaac and Rebekah. And what do we notice? Well, we first notice that Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah to wife. And so basically they were married for nearly 20 years before they had any children. And we see here, what does it tell us? It says that Isaac entreated the Lord for his wife. He was begging. He was praying. He was beseeching on a continual basis to the Lord that they could have children because she was barren. And he didn't give up on it. This wasn't just a one-time in treatment. This wasn't a one-time prayer. This wasn't a one-time, just calling out and crying out before the Lord. It was a continual thing. And they just trusted the Lord. They saw how his father had a child in his old age. And so they knew it was quite possible. And I've known people that have, even in our modern society, I've been a direct witness to people that could not have children, and they didn't feel it was the Lord's will for them to adopt. And they never gave up. They just kept praying. They continued to pray. And in a couple instances, when they thought that, or maybe they didn't think it, but maybe they were considering that it might be past due and that it wasn't going to happen because of their age, then lo and behold, a miracle child happened. And basically in their old age, in their middle age. And God provided for them in due time, and he answered their prayers. Well, we're going to have to call it close, but we're going to look at those verses and expound on those in our next lesson. And we're going to be looking at the lives of Isaac and Rebekah and these two children. She's going to have those twins. And it's very interesting there when we see that, the question she asked, she says, if it be so, why am I thus? And they were actually, because they were struggling, they were basically almost having a battle within her womb. And she was calling out to the Lord, trying to find out what that was all about, what was going on. And then we see that even when they were born, it's interesting to note how the one had his hand on the other one's heel, and that's going to play out. So we'll be talking about that in our next lesson, the children of Isaac and Rebekah. And we hope to see you then. I hope you're having a great day. See you soon.